Wowzer! Howdy, 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 howdy. Welcome, welcome. I am super honored that you all took time out of your lives to show up. Very, very honored that this very distinguished person is willing to come out and spend some time on the stage with me. About a year ago exactly, I was sitting right there as Sugi Jana Shortal read from Brotherless Night, her amazing book of fiction about Sri Lankan Civil War. And one of the big points on that was that it was a book that she worked on since about 2008, and all the questions were like, wow, you worked on it for so long. And I sat there anonymous with a manuscript in the hopper saying, I've been working on this thing since 1998. This is old. I've got lines in here that are definitely older than Dina's kids. I really, really appreciate you all coming out. I love this bookstore. I love that we're here in person. The human connection took a kind of a kidney shot during the pandemic. And one of the things that I've seen a lot of people talk about since then is our fractured culture, our isolation. And one of the things that also happens is the notion of self-care means that people end up going home and staying home after a day doing whatever they're doing that doesn't necessarily fill their souls. And when you're home and you're scrolling through any of your 1 to 5 devices, that isn't actually increasing your connection. So go out to see a play, go see music, go see some schmuck like me. It means a lot, and it keeps us closer together, and it keeps us informed, so I really appreciate you. I wrote this book. I started writing when I was a rookie, actually before I was a rookie even, and I was trying to make sense of what the fire service was. And I was trying to make sense of what it is we did, and then to explain to all the people who asked, why the hell is there a fire truck outside my house when I called 911 just for a ride to the hospital. And through that, I began to understand the sociology of emergency response and the realities of what Roger Hooter calls the gutter end of our healthcare system, right? So for many of us who trip and fall, who cut ourselves on a broken glass, who have chest pain, that is a regular 911 emergency. But for many, many, many of the rest of our people in our society, they call for all sorts of reasons. And the 911 system ends up being their primary care and their last resort. And that is what me and mine do. We respond over and over. While I was learning about this, I realized that all the rhetoric about firefighting was all steeped in this basically fireman nostalgia that you don't know if you'll be tough enough to handle a fire. And I kept waiting for these fires to show up, and they kept not showing up. Meanwhile, we kept going on medical call after medical call, and then we went to the occasional fire. They were cluster Fs, children. And they were, and I realized, particularly because I was a teacher, that we were not learning from what we were doing, and we basically had to do it my way or else, kind of a shouting old guard, right? I was born in the late 60s, raised in the 70s, came of age in the 80s. I'm anti-Reagan. I'm used to like crappy playgrounds, crappy after-school specials, and I don't mind getting yelled at. But when people yell out of fear or out of powerlessness, I don't respect that. And so I came into a job that was full of this hierarchy and this narrative. And I'm arrogant enough to say, I hear you yelling at me, but you're not telling me anything. And so from the very beginning, I didn't fit in, and I challenged. The other thing is, and I go into this very early in the book, is the woman who got me interested in the fire service was this wonderfully badass woman, a friend from DC. And through her kind of clutch of second wave female firefighters, I watched and listened as they talked not about saving lives and putting out fires, which they did, but about the ongoing and enduring chauvinism and misogyny that they dealt with every day in order just to learn how to be firefighters. It's gotten better, but it hasn't really changed, right? And so those are all the things that shaped what I looked at when I was trying to write this book. So on one hand, I'm trying to explain to any of you all who don't know what happens at end of life, what happens when people are hurt. I'm also trying to explain to you how the systems, EMS system, hospital system, city government, state government, and the individuals within them, without consciously colluding, set us up to fail, and set the machine to keep on churning. Okay? I'm going to read three connected or kind of interconnected excerpts to give you a flavor of the span of the book, and then we will either thumb wrestle or talk. And I'm generally raspy, and I'm coming over a cold. So if you can't hear me, just kind of flick your finger up, and I'll try to articulate better. One of Dina's kids asked me how long it's going to take me to read the whole book, and I said, all right. There's a firehouse saying, no one ever called 911 when they did something smart. This is a book about my 22 years as a firefighter EMT for the city of Minneapolis. 22 years in which I've had an intimate view of the 911 emergency medical system and the almost unfathomable reality of what passes for the social safety net in this country. From birth through death, people dial 911 and we respond. Actually, before birth, given prenatal issues and miscarriages, and after death, sometimes very long after life has departed a body. Few people understand what firefighters actually do. It bemuses me to explain, yet again, to a 911 caller, let alone to police or my relatives, why there is a fire truck outside when someone, quote, just wants a ride to the ER. We explain that the ambulance is not merely a fancy taxi. The paramedics are skilled professionals trained to do advanced pre-hospital care. And we are not simply burly fire dudes who break doors and squirt water. If you call 911 in the middle of the night in Minneapolis for a minor issue, especially if you say any of the words, the magic words, heart, breathing, chest pain, you will find one of our big red trucks right outside your house faster than you expect. Because if you are in fact dying, you will need all of us working hard to give you a chance at survival. As a captain, a company commander, I am responsible first and foremost for the safety of my crew, and then for the delivery of our services on every call. I must assess, decipher, interpret, and take action within seconds. To do this well, I have to be skilled at reading situations and people. The complexities of the job are the complexities of human nature. We do not diagnose illnesses. We interpret signs and symptoms. We read the person, listening and observing critically. If we don't know or do not care to look past the surface, we fail to see what's really going on. And not every captain can or is willing to do that. Trauma Sponges is set in Minneapolis, Minnesota, literally anywhere within city limits. On the streets and in the alleys, in homes and apartments that are spacious and well kept, or cluttered, or barren, on bridges and along the riverbanks. Firefighters witness the full range of human behavior and the complex dynamics that shape our society. But our view comes amid chaos and horror and absurdity. The existential nature of our profession may be what cuts deepest. We cannot force anyone to change their habits, their influences, their beliefs. The systemic solutions that should exist do not. There is no protecting emergency workers from the daily immersion in others' suffering. The job is, by definition, a traumatic experience. How we live with it, how we manage to continue to do the work without cracking up, or how we crack up. Those stories are the B-sides to the depths of woe we witness. This could be the things we carried an EMS version. Shout out to Tim O'Brien. The corrosive effects of this work on the people who do it are exacerbated by an enduring macho firehouse culture. This book seeks to challenge that culture and its deadly consequences. In my line of work, hypermasculinity and a desperate denial have pushed the incidences of PTSD, stress, and suicide to crisis levels. This mythos of machismo is ingrained from rookie school, reinforced by relentless peer culture. It provides a performative identity that many coworkers cling to at horrendous personal and cultural cost. Physical and emotional trauma, depression, the burgeoning rates of PTSD and suicide. Throughout my career, and as I've worked on this book, revisiting old calls, sifting through details, I've been shocked by the number of my peers who manage to ignore the human aspect of our work. Some of my coworkers cannot remember a single detail from incidents we experienced together. I recognize that the depths of sorrow and pain I've experienced vicariously are probably not very healthy. Many other coworkers carry unresolved grief and guilt that weigh on them, eat at them, haunt them, even writing about it. While I feel better purging some ghosts and hard bits, I do find myself steeped in the mire. But then, remaining open to what I see, both the beauty and the horror, reinforces what it means to be deeply human. So that's the intro. I will say, there's a lot of funny bits in here. There's not a whole lot of victories, because it's a job based on seeing people struggle. So even our good outcomes are generally shitty outcomes. This is from towards the end. I was on shift on September 11th, 2001. The falling towers did not reach South Minneapolis, and I spent the day transfixed, like much of the world, staring at the television. I was with two crews of guys who had never been to New York City, who had no idea of the scope of what had happened. I worried about friends of mine in New York. It was a heavy, shocking day. I got off shift and went home, looking to hold Annie, whose birthday, September 12th, had a definite pall cast over it, and to snuggle my baby daughter, Flan. As I got out of my car, I said hello to the neighbor across the street. He was walking from his car to his house as well. We weren't close, but America had just been attacked. Human contact was at a premium. "How are you doing?" I asked, but probably not like that. "How's it going?" He stopped and looked at me, blank and lost. Before I even finished the thought that he was taking it harder than I was, and I'd spent the day with fire guys who both second-guessed FDNY's actions with sublimely stupid confidence of people who had never seen a 100-story building, while also fighting furiously to suppress the raw terror of what those New York guys had experienced. My neighbor gestured vaguely, not toward the eerily blue sky as I expected, but at the car and then their house. "She's gone. She died yesterday." His wife had been sick with cancer. We were not close. I had no idea how ill she was. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He stared some more, then walked inside. I didn't remember his name. The poor guy's wife died on 9/11. His grief was enormous and specific. It wasn't the flash of planes striking the towers or jet fuel immolating the damaged floors or the surreal collapses. No. His wife died of cancer, died in a hospital bed with him by her side. He likely watched the television coverage as she slipped away. Every TV in every room, every channel, every doctor, nurse, orderly, every family. Everyone focused on the same unthinkable monstrosity. It was inescapable. He now faced the aftermath of the attacks and her death, alone. Walking out of the hospital, driving home, alone. Walking up the steps, alone. Entering that empty house, alone. Her death eclipsed by the myopic national panic and grief of the terrorist attacks. What room would there be for his sorrow? The world spins on. It always does. Your heart is broken and someone is mad about a lunch order. Your wife dies and your boss still needs the report by Monday. People got sick and died unrelated to the racial justice unrest. People died from things other than COVID. We went to work and we responded to the panorama of human experience, as is our charge, as we do. And I'm going to end with the beginning of a chapter that I started writing at the end of 221, trying to make sense of all the unexamined, unprosecuted, unaddressed deaths by people, basically unarmed black and brown men, by police in America. And the more I researched, the more I saw the connections and I saw the lack of willingness to make the connections. And so in the middle of this book, I dropped like a 50-page chapter that is the only thing I've actually seen really putting things together. So I'm quite proud of myself, although that plus $20 gets me $20. So I start with a quote by James Baldwin from The Price of the Ticket. I learned that to be a Negro meant precisely that one was never looked at, but was simply at the mercy of the reflexes the color of one's skin caused in other people. I was sitting in my fire station in South Minneapolis one morning in January 2023 when I learned of the death of Keenan Anderson after an encounter with the Los Angeles Police Department. I was sitting in the same chair the night of May 25th, 2020, when the Minneapolis police used overwhelming physical force on a forgery suspect, a man who stated from the beginning of their interaction that he was anxious, claustrophobic, and hyperventilating. That man, George Floyd, died on the street 6 blocks from where I sat. He was not fighting the police, he was fighting to breathe. My crew and I responded, and we assisted paramedics in the futile attempt to restore Mr. Floyd's life. In the days and weeks afterward, we responded to the spasms of anguish and fury on the streets. In the years afterwards, we have worked with the residents, the activists, and the protesters, seeking to find a better way forward. Our connections have been at the interpersonal, not systemic or structural levels, meeting person to person as human beings, not types. Wherever I've traveled in this country since 2020, Boston, Oakland, DC, New York, small towns along the way, I've seen Mr. Floyd's likeness painted on walls, in store windows, on posters, packages, merchandise, his name invoked as I always blow this word, I'm so sorry. Synecdoche, thank you. Synecdoche and Creedicor. That's what happens when you spend a lot of time as a kid reading without reading to yourself. I have great vocabulary, but poor pronunciation. As Synecdoche and Creedicor. Mr. Floyd and his death were not a symbol or construct for my crew. It is strange and haunting to have been involved literally and physically in something so profound, something so complicated. I testified in the state and federal trials of the officers who killed Mr. Floyd. The defense lawyers parsing legal technicalities almost obscured the basic fact that the officers crushed the man's life out of him. What changes has Minneapolis made? Or any city in America? How have we learned nothing? Not since the police killed Mr. Floyd, but long before. How many unarmed black men have been killed by police and witnessed and recorded with no substantive intervention or correction from the governing bodies, the courts, the police themselves? You might reasonably believe that there have been significant changes and reforms to how emergency responders, police especially, engage the public. That Minneapolis' strong mayor and diverse city council demanded investigations and significant change in the police department regarding how the police engage civilians, especially those displaying crisis or incoherence. That the spark from 38th and Chicago and South Minneapolis ignited a national awareness and improvement. You would be wrong. All right, thank you all.
Like the animal sitting all on top of us right now, where do we even begin? Which is, as I finished this book this morning, chapter specifically, Gotta Mean or Kill a Man, just read that one and you'll buy the book. Especially, you don't have to be a resident of Minneapolis, you have to be a resident of the human experience to know how much of that is true. And in my work as a journalist, Jeremy and I are kind of like on adjacent highways running towards people's worst moments in their lives. And so much of it I understood from afar, but I'm so grateful for it as a person who, in my heart of hearts, is in public service as a journalist in this community, and want to understand and want to get to the truth, because as we said, it still has to matter. Jeremy, you wrote this book, as you joked, starting in about 1998, as this sort of memoir, but not in the glowing terms of what you saw in firefighting. But the first thing that I wanted to know as your bio was read and when I was reading this, as you took a critical lens on firefighting and these establishment jobs, how does someone go from creative writing to teaching to becoming a fire person?
Boy fire lady is the appropriate term. I think it's interesting because lots and lots of people apply for different jobs. So I'd been teaching and I'd been working odd jobs, and when I met my friend Jen, who was a young firefighter, she was swashbuckling and dating, I won't say promiscuously, she was dating exuberantly. She had health care, she had time off, she had dental, and a paycheck. I was working for one of the Kim Bartonman machines and had no paycheck, no steady paycheck, and no health insurance. So I was like, that looks good. And it was also a way to help people. And then even coming in though, as much as I think anyone can do a job, there are types. And so even as there's been progress and we are more diverse, and as backwards as the fire service is as a profession, there are lots more different people coming in. But it's kind of like when I moved to Chattanooga in the early 90s, and people were like, hey, it's only about 20 years behind the rest of America now. High five, right? So that it's a very, very atavistic job, and the people who are drawn to it still create a core, like a lowest common denominator, of fairly traditional reactionary people. Lots of men and women in this job are very interesting. I've got two good friends here tonight who are coworkers who both defy the expectations, and yet I think both would agree that there are the massive common people is a very distinct type.
You talk a lot too in the very beginning about establishing kind of this baseline, both in teaching, I feel, as just being a citizen of the planet, and in firefighting, and both on your end of it and me as a South Minneapolis citizen of it, of the social contract. Is the social contract to you something that is unique to fire and community, or is it person to person? What do you mean by the social contract?
That's a good question. There's one hand in which you dial 911 and someone's going to show up. That's the social contract. And that is the launching point, the Good Samaritan principle, for how much of our system is off its track because we don't have the money or the leadership to say, let's examine this. I will say, and people have read this book and said, wow, it kind of gives me a grim look at firefighters. Like, there's people who are horrific who will come out and treat you great, right? And that it's not necessarily being false. They are doing their job professionally, even if they hold horrible attitudes about the type of person someone is. And I think that doing service, helping people, is part of the contract. And I also write in the book that so many of us start out not understanding what we're going to be doing. So I think police, firefighters, and paramedics want to do police crap, medic crap, fire crap. And then what we're really doing most of the time is addressing all the holes in the safety net, right? So that, think about that dissonance. You want to put out fires, you want to stop crime, you want to do cool heart attack stuff in an ambulance, and most of the time you're running to people who don't have enough, like don't have housing, don't have medication, don't have money, and so we are dealing with the holes in the safety net, and it's just us, right? There's nobody else to call. So, and some of us burn out because we don't understand that is the truth of our job.
Right, and I thought of that when I was reading so much. You have so many stories and examples. I urge you to read it just for the examples from our own community, so you don't have to take it from your local news or an article. You can see it told in real time with real locations about how this works, or rather doesn't work. And that you go on these call after call after call. And what came to mind, what maddens me, is on X, Twitter, whatever it's called, or I go to numerous candidate speeches or those that hold office, and they just use this blanket term of mental health. We need money for mental health. Like, what does that even mean? And when you read Jeremy's examples of the struggles that people face, minute to minute, hour to hour, in every corner of this city, that's the reality of someone in a mental health crisis. And yet, I don't see any these promises for money going to the places where these people need access to. And I assume that's what you mean by the maddening aspect of it. Like, I'm here right now doing this frontline work. I don't know what they're talking about in front of the press.
No, absolutely. I think someone, when I was trying to pitch the book, someone said, hey, this is great. You could write a book on reforming the healthcare system.
Oh, super.
And I was like, sure, it's gonna be really short. I don't have money, I don't have power, therefore we're not changing squat. Right? Like that the lip service and the gestures get so utterly torpedoed by the ugly realities, because for-profit healthcare and insurance companies drive the ship, right? So it's possible with the money to actually affect real change, but it's gonna require shifting how we approach these things. And at a street level, none of us are gonna be able to do it. And at a policy level, we seem to be incapable of not goat effing all the good possible ways of moving forward, so that we're just stuck with political promises and money and semi-good faith, maybe good faith. Like the PCR team here, behavioral crisis response team, was underfunded, was basically kneecapped from the very beginning. So it's there, and the mayor, when it's convenient, points to it, but they were never, I said, why don't we train with them? Because if they're trained social workers, I want to learn how to do my job better. I want to be able to help any of you before they show up. No, it's territorial pissing. They just said it's not that way, right?
I'm gonna use that tomorrow night on the news.
As long as you quote
When we
Nirvana.
get that offer to go on the ride along with the behavioral crisis response team, like, which they do great work, and I've seen them many a time on scene, but it's that lack of coordination. Because I, as a taxpayer, my wife and I always joke, I'm like, I want like an itemization list of like, I want all my money to go there, and let me see if it works, you know?
It's the old let the military hold bake sales and the kids get rich on,
I don't know what you're talking about. There are other parts of this book as we lead up into, you know, some of those more difficult chapters. There's different things. You could do a chapter and then have a week-long discussion about it. And you do devote, and it takes born men to do this, to say this misogyny is rampant. Because if I say it, it's an eye roll for several reasons. But you talk about going back, you know, the hyper focus in this community, and for good reason, is on Minneapolis police for some of the things that they've done, or many of the things they've done since their inception. But there's also, I don't think there's a sense of critical history, at least in my newsroom, that in the 1970s, Minneapolis Fire was really on top of the mountain for shunning anyone of color and anyone with a vagina, or who identifies with it.
yes. I don't think it was actually in the lawsuit in those words, but
Well,
absolutely.
Let's just boil it down. I mean,
So-
you have an example in the book
Yes.
of former Mayor Sharon Sales Belton getting up to address the fire department for the very first time, and the men of this fire department stood up and turned to make sure that she only saw their backs, not interested in hearing from a woman, and definitely not a black woman.
No, absolutely. I think, and this is a challenge, because I'm trying, you know, okay, hashtag not all men, hashtag not all firefighters, great. Okay, but I'm trying to be somewhat fair, right? And because there are lots and lots of really good white dudes who do a good job. Like, I work with a lot of, and yet, if you think about the newsroom, and if you think about fire service, you think about if you're an educator, if you think about you're a banker, what do the walls look like? The Hall of Heroes are all white men, because guess who was only allowed to apply for those jobs for the first 200 years of existence, right? So it's not innate that white Irish dudes or white Scandinavian dudes out here do a better job. They're the only ones who are allowed. Newsroom, like, she's a groundbreaker. Like, that fighting to be seen and treated as a person without having to always fight against the misogyny before you learn how to do your craft in journalism, your craft in banking, your craft in teaching. Like, so this artificial normal is one of the things that I pushed against, this idea that all the reactionary people saying that it's being ruined by diversity. It's like, your normal was never real, right? It was never a real thing that, like, women are statistically smarter than we are. Like, so they can figure stuff out. but we didn't let them in. Minneapolis was so advanced in its backwards thinking that it lost a 30-year federal injunction for its rampant racism. And that's not because it was a bad apple and all the rest of the fire departments were good. Like, they just got caught and refused to make changes. Like, so that is some defiant A-level, like, bastard behavior. And so they got caught cold in federal court. And then we had court-ordered diversity, which is the only way we were gonna get diversity, right? And that didn't ruin the department. But it gave all the people who wanna whine about it the sense that it's been ruined because we had to let people in, right? And so I keep saying when people are like, we're being hard on, not all white men, all that, I'm like, well, we haven't even looked at all the ways that we've made life hard for the people who would have been good firefighters, but we wouldn't let black men, we wouldn't let brown men, we wouldn't let Asian men, we wouldn't let Native men, we wouldn't let any women of any stripe do the job, right? And then the ones who fought their way on, we made feel unsafe, unwelcomed, all the rest. So,
Is it different now?
yes and no. Yes, like absolutely. There's more. We are slowly, like, culture is changing. We have more people who are comfortable. I mean, I write in there that when I started in 2000, it was kind of like with rap. All the men were hysterically obsessed with finding that one gay rapper. There were more than one. Same thing with firefighting. And like there was like the unthinking and not even trying to be mean, homophobia was rampant. It was unquestioned. And so it's gotten better. But again, the mass of people want life to be a certain sort of way. Like a lot of firefighters vote Republican, that's fine if that's your kick, but they vote against unions, they vote against the labor movement, they vote against benefits, they vote against their own best interests because they identify with a charlatan like Trump because they need to have their masculinity reinforced. So at a certain point, I don't know how much I'm going to have to talk with them as a peer because it's my job, not yours, right? It's my job, not hers, not Dick's in the back. Like, it's my job to talk to my people. And I'm like, you guys aren't listening and you don't want to hear it. Like, this is a long book, there are a lot of words, no photos. So a lot of the people who don't like me are never going to read this book.
All right, let's pivot a little bit because about midway through the book, it's hard to remember, and you had a line in there that I wish I would have written down, but I didn't because I felt it when I read it. When you talk about the beginning days of COVID, and we knew fire, as a journalist, I was one of the only people in the building at Care 11. It was eerie, odd. I went there every day. It was kind of nice. It was like a huge building. It was all mine. It got old after a while. But if you can let yourself kind of go back in time to remember that like many people didn't have to be out in society, and many people did, including fire, and by nature of what you're talking about being medical calls, you can't really social distance in a medical emergency.
No.
And you talk a bit about COVID, and then you kind of lean into, because the murder of George Floyd happens in 2020, so not too long after we've sat in the COVID train. And I heard this in the newsroom too. There was a lot of words about safety first when COVID came. You know, I do all these things to be safe. And then there were a lot of things after the murder of George Floyd about safety after the uprisings, after the people took to the streets to say justice needs to come, and it needs to come 400 years ago, but we're saying right now too. The word that was always used was safety, and you wrote the difference between being uncomfortable on a call and being unsafe on a call. Those are different things. But I got from my management too, safety first, and I'm like, what you're describing is discomfort. That's not safety. You're describing that you're nervous. Tell me about what that meant in fire situations. You were being told, don't do that, it's unsafe, but really your bosses were just uncomfortable.
I think that I would actually say that they weren't even uncomfortable, they weren't thinking. And so much of what happened as I wrote this book is my smaller points became larger points. And so when I wrote the chapter, and I was kind of writing as we went through the various incarnations of Delta and Omicron, and I was literally all caps screed. I was screaming I was sputtering. I was so angry at our cultural failure to take good care. This idea that we need to save ourselves for fires only was what our former leadership came up with. Not the fact that what we were doing, the best thing we could do, was to go out and serve the public, right? Because everyone was strapped, everyone was desperate and scared. Our job is to serve the public, right? Our job is to put on a mask, and so I did. Like my sense of what a COVID risk was so blown away because we were doing CPR on people who were just spewing spumes of COVID and blood and everything else in the air, and if you wore gloves and glasses and all the rest, the majority of us managed not to get it. But the overall, we need to save us for fires. We're not going to fires because no one's doing anything. But they are dying in the streets, they're dying in their homes, they're sick. That is our job. That is the essence of our work, is to serve our community, right? But I'm not in charge. In the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd and the uprising, there were, and I still work right down the street from, in South Minneapolis, right down the street from 38th in Chicago. It was a rare moment where white people, or white badged responders, are not in charge. We went into a now black majority environment. If you've never been in that, it feels scary, but it feels uncomfortable. No one was threatening me, and look, I've got a face that's punchable. I'm white as shit, I've got a punchable face, I've got staring eyes. And yes, some young kids gave a shit because they didn't see the difference between cop and police, and really we're all white dudes in badges, right? But someone hard-eyeing me is much different from me actually being threatened. And so my mission became, because I got to know the people who were activists, shout out to Neil, and were committed to making a better start in this country after what has gone on. And yet, as a default, our upper administration, the paramedics, many of whom don't live in they don't have the ability to stay in an area and know people, but get to know people. So a lot of them were afraid. A lot of them were kind of more suburban. And then the police were a whole separate issue, right? So this fear of we're not coming in because of safety. And what that meant was that they were slow rolling medical responses that had nothing to do. Like after the first 4 days, there were not riots, right? Lots of people got sick and died. There were unfortunately a couple bad domestic murders because men continued to be horrible to women and others in that area. And they waited and waited because we could not get people in, because even some of my coworkers said, we're not going in because the bosses said, wait until the police get there. And the police were saying, F that, we're not getting in there, we're afraid. We're not afraid, we're safety. And so the citizens who are responding, if you fell down and re-break your leg and no one comes because that someone says something, dispatch says, wait until police get there because we hear people shouting. It's just me yelling, but they hear in the background, they say, we don't know, for safety, no one show up. If you actually nick an artery and you're bleeding out and everyone's panicking and the paramedics and fire truck are around the corner waiting, I say that is a failure of our sworn duty and our obligation, right?
So you're talking about, and many of you maybe heard anecdotally or experienced, I live in that neighborhood too, called a no-go zone or this wait zone. And Jeremy talks in detail, and it's history for us now, but it's something that's important to read and listen to what he's trying to tell you, in that if that happened to you, and I'm going to try and just parse it in layman's terms, and maybe everybody understands, and I'm really sorry, I have a 2-year-old, so I over-explain, that Jeremy could be 2 blocks away from you, but Jeremy's told, wait, you can't go there until police get there, and police aren't going to that area very quick. So what could be an injury that we could help you with suddenly gets escalated because of this whole idea of what's safe. Well, what's safe is Jeremy's response. He needs to get to you. And they're saying, wait till the cops get there first. That's not how it was before Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd. Derek Chauvin's choice to put you in that situation.
Well, I would actually say that we do have a reactionary, unthinking system. So there are ways that, without being explicitly racist, hearing upset black voices often tricks a voice in a box in dispatch saying, seen as chaotic stage for police, and that's been true for a long time. But I also want to say that's one of the things that I push in this book, the systemic and the individual, right? Because there wasn't a they saying, let's not do this, let's slow roll it, let's make them suffer. It was no one was willing to question, do we need to stage for this? Do we need to wait for police? Is this an actual threat? Right? No one was putting that, there's no they there is no overarching intelligence, and I mean that with every freaking interpretation, making decisions about it, right? And then who suffers, the moral trauma is of me and mine who want to go out and help, and the majority, and I stress this, the overwhelming majority of my coworkers want to help people. And not being able to, and then arriving late and feeling useless causes the moral trauma. And for all the citizens who are trying to do right and sitting there, because if you've ever been there with someone with a broken leg who's screaming, or someone who's unresponsive, that clock is not going fast. And you might think it's 42 minutes and it's actually 2.5 minutes later, but it is very hard on you. And I think that is unacceptable for us to make people suffer for absolutely unspecified fears. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's still upsetting, but it answers my question. You know, in the book, as you get towards, Jeremy talked about starting to write it in the late 90s, and then, you know, during COVID. And I knew reading it, like, we're going to get to 2020 at some point in this book. And it does take you back a bit, but it takes you there with a different lens. I mean, I met Jeremy, I believe, after he became a witness for the state. I remember seeing him, I can still, as clear as day, see him in that trial, watching every second of that trial. My coworker saying, that's my friend Jeremy. I remember reaching out, because it's, you know, it's the cat chasing the tail media, like, oh, witness, talk to witness, right? And I got to know Jeremy, and so it was a privilege to read this book, and he's also my neighborhood fire captain. I live near 38th in Chicago, so when he starts to talk about the problems within the system and that ingrained sense of fear that comes when the person 911 is called about is a person of color, it will take you back. And you have to remember always that it was a beautiful night in May, it was warm, and it was a forgery call. And Jeremy and his crew responded to that call. The sentence in the chapter entitled "The Assassination of George Floyd" by coward Derek Chauvin. Bold chapter title. That's chapter 15, that's the title of it. But I thought to myself when I first read it, I'm like, that's direct. But then this afternoon when I was thinking about it more, I wondered if you made the title of chapter 15 so certain, because in this day and age, history is just rewritten every day. Oh, slavery is being retooled. Yesterday, January 6th, it was just a bunch of gathering. And so that you wanted to make sure on your book that it said right there in plain day, bold font, what happened on May 25th. And it was the assassination of George Floyd by coward Derek Chauvin.
The assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert, whatever was the movie. So it was a Minnesota throw.
I don't know what that means.
So it was so much of the book is because I am kind of Gen X. I have ridiculous references and allusions and play on words, and no one but me needs to get them. And boy, I've used the shit out of myself. But some people do. Hi, Kyle. And get them. But yes, I went with that because, well, for many reasons. Because I know I've got black friends who will not watch the footage. And I understand that. And I also have black friends who have a faulty breakdown of what actually happened. And I get that too. I have many, many white friends and people I know who have tried to avoid the discomfort of that. They saw a little bit of Darnella Fraser's video and said, oh, that was horrible. You know, and I say in the book, that was not my first, not my second, at least it was my third killing by police, right? So going back to 2002, right? So for people who say it's too much to talk about, oh, it's a mistake, oh, this and that, I have you might have picked up, a vein of fury in me, like an unquenchable sense that we continue to avoid what we need to look at. And so in that chapter, I break down all the ways that the system failed those young officers, the way that the legal system failed, the way that our city council and our mayor failed, and then I break down and say this is such a human flaw because the police have not been held accountable, have not policed themselves. Derek Chauvin did the same thing with 2 of the 3 officers on May 8th, so 17 days before. Had somebody in the police system, including himself, said, dude, maybe you don't want to jank the first black dude you see, the other officers might have been more willing to say, are we really doing the wrong thing or the right thing here? But their system, even more so than the fire system, the hierarchy puts in place, you don't question your senior officer. And to that end, one of the things I do say is, I think, my good friend Abby Sarah is a lawyer and was in the Civilian Review Board, and she's very aware of probably 30 plus complaints against Chauvin that never got investigated because the city is not interested in policing itself. The two new police officers, J. Alexander King and Tom Lane, they embodied what for me I see in the fire service. One of them knew what the right thing to do is. And Tom Lane kind of meekly said, shouldn't we check this? Should we check his pulse? Should we do this? But their hierarchy is absolutely unidirectional. You don't question your senior training officer, right? So Tom Lane knew the right thing to do and he was not empowered and not comfortable doing it. He still participated in the murder of a man. J. Alexander King went the other way, trying to calm, they were both trying to calm George Floyd down until Chauvin approached, and then their senior guy, their training boss, shows up shouting. And what happens when people shout? You panic and respond. And at that moment was when J. Alexander King upped the physical struggle in the back of the car that led to the panic, that led to Mr. Floyd getting down on the ground, which led to them kneeling on him. Had he not felt the pressure to be the sort of man who has to show out that he's not going to be punked by some street guy, and actually thought and looked at what they were having, Mr. Floyd would be alive or not have died that day, and we would have had a different, later, subsequent death by police that would have set things off. And that is a systemic issue, and that is an individual issue. And I make analogies in the book to firefighting, because when we F up, we don't kill civilians, we kill ourselves, right? And I look at that and say all the ways that machismo and posturing hurt firefighters. And then looking at it, because, and I'm not a police officer, I'm not a lawyer, but I've also been on these calls and I've studied and looked at how little our culture is willing to embrace and investigate and address.
He talks about that earlier in the book. It is like the valor of the mentality of a firefighter. It's like, I'm going to run in this, I'm going to choose an unsafe option, and I'm going to go down in that fire, and that's acceptable. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, essentially, we're going to ignore our hearts, so if I die on a fire ground, I'm a hero. Instead, if I die in my recliner, I'm just a fat F. But making bad decisions, not learning strategy and tactics because we're so afraid of looking bad and posturing. Yes, that.
I want to open it up for questions because there's a lot of people here that deserve to be able to ask you questions that we could sit here all night and talk, but my wife said I can't do that. So if anybody has a question, we're in a small enough space, an intimate enough space, you can just raise your hand. I think Jeremy will be able to hear you. If not, I'll shout it in his ear. Ageism, wow. Wow!
So I work as a public health nurse, and we have a small company where the providers go to see the patients in their home, and most like a pharmacist, and then all of our team will go see them to try to prevent that gap in care where you talk about where they end up in the hospital. Do you talk much? I know you said you really wouldn't write a book about how to change the healthcare system. Do you talk about where there's smaller ways to try to prevent these gaps or these holes that are costing our healthcare system so much money? Where we can try to, working on making small changes within the healthcare system to try to address that challenge.
Thank you for being a public health nurse.
And thank you for wearing that hat. In addition, I want to support both your work and your hat.
What's the hat?
It's just a nice toque. Well, there are many, many solutions. Many people way smarter and more experienced than I have brought them up, but it all comes down to money. So for most part, insurance companies and the corporations that run them are much more willing to let me die or keep having this ongoing health problem rather than paying a nurse to come in or a PCA or somebody to come in and check on me. Because if they hire somebody full-time, that is a full-time employee, they have to pay benefits and all the rest. If they just keep hoping it won't happen tomorrow, it keeps happening. And so there have been very successful cases where they have dedicated social workers and nurses to the top 15 or 25 frequent flyers in a city, in an ambulance, in a hospital setting. And it has reduced the calls for care, but no one is willing to pay the money to do that, so no.
I have a question about culture change. My brother is a 20-year veteran at the fire department as well. He's just getting back to work now after taking some time off to do PTSD therapy after having a cardiac incident that damaged his heart. My question is about what kind of reception do you think he'll get coming back into kind of fire bro culture? And secondly, so much of the book is about this tension between being empathetic and also protecting yourself. And I think that having seen him get sort of sucked into this culture a little bit, which he did not grow up with, this kind of hard macho dude with this like hippie family, but I think he got kind of hazed, this kind of like rookie check a pulse kind of hazing as a youngster. And I just wonder if you could speak in detail a bit to what kind of training up of the youngsters would get to that culture where you're dealing with that tension in a more human way. I mean, I know you talk about that a lot in the book too.
Well, first of all, I'm glad your brother is doing better, and I assume that he will be welcomed back warmly, because it's always great to see somebody come back to work. On the other side of that, I don't know, because I try to encourage people to know themselves, like to thy own self be true, and to realize the con of trying to fit in, and that it doesn't, like none of the people who tell you not to wear your mask when you're at a car fire are going to be at your hospital bed when you end up getting lung cancer. So much of it is this juvenile behavior. I think there are many more of us who realize that old way is gone, and but the bigger crisis is we haven't figured out how to fill it, right? And so I think there's much more tolerance and understanding, and culture's kind of improved a little bit, but there's still a fundamental existential question about what does it mean to do this job, how to do it, right? And I readily admit that I'm kind of an outlier.
Yeah, it's interesting from afar. I have a 2-year-old and he has fire trucks and they go wheel, 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 right? And I know Jeremy, and Jeremy's more like that gracious woman in the back. Jeremy's more of a mental health nurse that occasionally fights a fire. A public health nurse that occasionally fights a fire.
Yeah. Questions? Yes.
So how do you manage that cognitive dissonance? Because it seems as if you do run against the grain based on what we know about the culture. And you have to work with it every day. We all have to work with misogyny and racism, whether it's implied or outright. But this is a brotherhood, and this is like people that rely on each other in their jobs. How do you deal with that? How do you reconcile that? And I'm guessing you see a lot of bad behavior on a regular basis.
Yeah. And I mean, I think of Monty Python, like I'm a child of the 70s. So almost everything comes with a lot of wry absurdity that kind of buffers it. So not all men, like it's a brotherhood and a sisterhood, which is tacked on, but it isn't a sisterhood because statistically there's so few women, and many of the women struggle to feel like they even belong. I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to put anybody who knows me, who works with me, on the spot here. But I try to lacerate all the bull that crowds people's minds and trying to fit in. I try to make explicit, and probably ad nauseum, all the ways that the behavioral con sets people up to fail. And then just try to model, maintaining my own integrity, I guess.
We have time for one more question. It better be good.
I'm just wondering if 85% of your calls are not fire related and 12% of people are women in the industry, roughly.
Sounds like a math question coming.
How do you change that idea of what a firefighter is?
That's great. I mean, I posed at the beginning that it is we are literally in an existential conundrum because, and the more we embrace that we are emergency responders, like, because you need people to fight fire. We do fight fire. And you don't get to, and that's one of the reasons I wrote this book also was because under Ryback and under Palenti, all the like kind of self-serving budget cuts, the council members saying, oh, you can do this with 2 people. And I also want to say real quick, Jana came up several years ago, a decade plus ago, to do the Fire Ops 101, which is, it's as good, which was designed for city council members and politicians to realize how hard it is to do the thing.
I am not in the city council, nor do I ever wish to be, nor
No,
do I want to be a politician.
but we brought the press came up, and she did great. She did not have a good time. I was there. It was wonderful, and you did, and it sucked, and you said it, and you would never do it again. But part of it was to share this idea that it's a lot harder
Yeah.
than it seems. But some of that's like I say, yes, that's true, and yes, it's dangerous. But most of the time, we make bad decisions. So if we take all the EMS away, all the other stuff away, on the strict fireground stuff, we have a culture that doesn't really look at do what we've got actually written down to do it right. And so that's kind of where it goes to your question. I am constantly comfortable riding face first into the breach, like.
Yeah, and I'll just say this too, so when we see each other professionally, it's again in those toughest moments. And we don't have, yes, maybe 10% of the calls are fire calls, but those 10% need firefighters. And it is a job that is unique to this group of individual people, different from others. And I've never been at a fire in Minneapolis where the professionalism wasn't tantamount.
No, it's true.
It's true. It really is. And it's interesting in journalism, and I can't say the same for all other agencies, but I can say that about fire. And there's a certain part of whether people want to get into it for that or not, and that we'll see how the branding of it becomes this call to service, because it truly is kind of a pure call to service. And there's so many stories in this book about a woman who loses her husband and she's not realized he's gone, heart attacks, things like that. That person that comes to my home in my darkest hour, I want it to be somebody like Jeremy. I want it to be somebody like that public health nurse. That's the social contract to me, is that at bare minimum, it's dignity and respect. And at maximum, you get a little bit more. And then there's a fire, so they're actually, we should pay them double, because they play so many different roles for us. And so I'm grateful for your service. I'm grateful for the fire station at 38th that he's on, because they let your kids in and hang out. It's super cool. I don't know all the other ones, but it's the super coolest one.
Well, we have the coolest logo because we have a
They do. If you have not seen the logo of this fire station, it is absolutely unbelievable. And it's not a naked lady, which is what the logos I grew up with. This is a dancing queer unicorn, which is a sign of progress, I say. When I show all my community that logo, they're like, "Are you serious?" It's like, yeah, 38th fire station.
As the woman and man says, F them if they can't take a joke. You had your hand up real quick.
He did it. Major Zink, when he took that last question, she's very nice.
Yeah, she's very nice.
I thought what was so interesting about the book is all your own self-reflection that you went into as you were thinking about all these things. And there was a moment in the book where you were in a really tense place. You kind of were spewing a little bit. Your wife said, "Hey, that's a little bit racist that I hear coming from you." And I just was so just drawn into that journey you went through on your own as you're rightly criticizing everything that's going on around you, but also yourself and how you brought that into that. I just wanted you to talk about that.
That was an excellent last question. Thank you for allowing it.
Yeah, I think when we start, they say, you will see them, they. Don't let them rub off on you. And them is amorphous, but generally becomes people who don't have health care, people who are poor, people who are struggling, people of color. And when you have a predominantly white, male, often suburban, reactionary workforce, that is what really launched this book. It's understanding that we're not as I said before, we're not questioning our own normal. And so I can fight and I can lead all day trying to argue for a more kind of aggressive compassion and looking at the sociology of all this. And the other part of it is we are seeing things that most people, I mean, other than journalists really, or child protection workers, do not see. And what we see is so far beyond what most people consider normal. And that is the tension, to go and see people who are generations deep in bad behavior or bad choices and poor options. And not, like as I say, it's like blame the game, not the players. And yet you are going in and seeing people like the shootings, the stabbings, the neglect, the abuse. You see it over and over again, and it's hard not to look at the person right in front of you who did the thing that brought you to try to, particularly for children, but and understanding that this person was F for fair going back 3 generations, and not hiding behind some airy platitudes, but saying like, and we go and we come back, and every single one of my coworkers, we go home and we come back the next day and we try. We have no idea what we're going to see. We have no idea who's going to call 911. None of you plan to see my round-ass face staring down at you, and yet it happens, right?
Plus, you never see the outcome, right?
And we don't get to see the outcome, right? And then so there's very little closure. And so we just keep going and keep going. I can tell people to quit smoking because that's objectively the right thing to say. But we see the end line, we see the abuse, and yet, and to not get broken. It is not a job for earnest people, I say that in here. And to keep coming back and to open a sliver of your heart to human connection. And I will say that I have enjoyed my job more since 2020 than I did beforehand. I feel the mission of connecting with the community and doing right and bearing witness and trying to do what little I can to offer the best part of me to both my coworkers and the public has made it, kept me from going nuts. Thank you all so very, very much. Jana, thank you so much. And I'll be over there signing stuff.